Farmer Frank couldn't believe his eyes when he found something under his field. Without thinking much of it, he took the object inside, pondering about what it could be. When he finally realized what the object could be, he immediately called the police, sending his wife away as far as possible from this object. When the police arrive and inspect the object, they have some unexpected news for Frank. But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Frank was plowing his field when he suddenly spotted something in his back view mirror. He immediately stopped his tractor and got off to see what it was. As he got closer, he realized his instincts were right. There was a big hole in his field where he had just plowed. This had never happened before, and Frank wondered what it could mean. He slowly crouched down, his heart beating in his chest. Was he seeing this correctly? Surely he couldn't. He reached his arm into the hole and picked up something that would forever change his life. Out of the hole, Frank pulled some sort of rock. It wasn't of the same material as his field. It actually wasn't of any material he had ever seen before. Frank inspected the strange rock intently and noticed how it glistened in the sun. Frank sighed. He just knew this thing was special. He could feel it. But why? Knowing he could never let this go, Frank went to his study. He placed the object on his desk and took a picture of it. He just had to know what this thing was. He quickly went to his own Facebook page and posted the picture on his feed. Maybe his fellow farmers had seen this sort of thing before. Sitting still was never Frank's strong suit, so as he waited for a reaction on his Facebook picture, he went back to the place where he found the object. Prepared with a shovel and gloves, he got down on his knees and began to dig into the hole. Frank found a total of 5 strange objects in the hole, and he only stopped because it got dark outside. He could hear his wife calling for him in the distance, so he quickly packed up his things and headed home. He ran upstairs to freshen up when he walked past his study. Suddenly, Frank stopped and backed up to look into the room. "Jolene, don't wait for me." Frank turned on the light in his study and slowly walked toward his desk. His eyes stood wide from shock, and he could feel his heart racing in his chest. The strange object he had found earlier today suddenly had paper clips stuck to it, and Frank knew for a fact that these paper clips were at the other end of the desk when he left. He almost dropped the object as his wife angrily yelled for him to come down, so he quickly cleaned himself up and went downstairs. "What is going on with you?" Jolene asked her husband as he sat down at the dining table. Frank looked at her, unsure of what to say. "It's the object. I just know there's more to it." Suddenly, everything clicked. Frank jumped up, almost knocking over his plate full of food. "Frank!" his wife exclaimed, but Frank didn't respond. He ran to the hallway and grabbed his phone out of his pocket. Without a second thought, Frank dialed 911, asking for the police to come to his house immediately. His wife, overhearing, gasped, "Frank, explain yourself!" Frank turned to Jolene, gripping her hands tightly. "You have to leave the house. Go to your mother's. I'll join you soon." Jolene, teary-eyed, nodded and rushed upstairs to pack. As she left, Frank felt a pang of guilt. Why had he brought the object into their home? Moments later, he saw the red and blue lights of police cars approaching. When the police arrived, Frank handed over the strange objects. The officer glanced at them, unimpressed. "Just some unusual stones," he remarked. Frank's heart sank. This was not the reaction he expected. "Please, look again. These aren't ordinary rocks," Frank insisted, but his pleas were dismissed. He felt isolated, his discovery treated as insignificant. After the police left, doubt crept in. Were they right? Were the objects meaningless? But as the last patrol car disappeared, Frank felt a spark of resolve. He couldn't let this go. Determined to uncover the truth, he gazed out over his fields, now shrouded in mystery. At dawn, Frank's quiet morning was disrupted by a fleet of police cars. This time, their urgency was palpable. "Mr. Frank, you must leave your property immediately, for safety reasons," an officer instructed, avoiding his gaze. Frank, confused, complied. As he left, he cast a lingering look at his beloved farm, now transformed into a sealed-off zone. Yellow tape and patrolling officers marked his land, now off-limits. What was once a source of pride had become a mystery. That night, far from home, Frank tossed and turned, haunted by unanswered questions. Sleep eluded him as his fears grew. The next day, Frank returned to find his farm unrecognizable. Vehicles with obscure logos lined the driveway, and people in uniforms worked with urgency. Frank's attempts to approach were met with polite but firm resistance. Frank's frustration grew as his questions were met with vague responses. Surrounded by strangers, he felt like an outsider on his own land. The disconnect between his once familiar fields and the current situation left him feeling invisible, his concerns brushed aside. That night, Frank lay awake, staring at the ceiling of an unfamiliar room. The oppressive silence was a stark contrast to the day's chaos. Questions about his farm spiraled in his mind, weaving a web of anxiety that kept sleep at bay. The night dragged on, filled with worry and uncertainty. The next day, Frank stood at the edge of his property, watching strangers bustle across his land. His farm, once a sanctuary of solitude, now felt foreign. Approaching an official, Frank pleaded, "Can you tell me what's going on?" The response was measured, evasive, and devoid of substance. Each vague answer only deepened his frustration and left him more in the dark. His anxiety mounted with each passing hour, and the absence of clear answers only intensified his unease. Surveying his farm's transformation, Frank felt a pang of loss. The once vibrant land was now sterile and unrecognizable. The rhythms of life he knew were replaced by an unsettling quiet, punctuated by commands and mechanical hums. His home felt like a distant memory. Frank watched helplessly as experts meticulously combed through his land. Approaching a geologist, Frank asked, "What's happening on my farm?" The geologist hesitated before offering a cryptic reply, further deepening the mystery. Frank's questions met walls of professional reticence, leaving him grappling with more uncertainties. The geologist's guarded words hinted at something significant yet unspoken. "We're conducting routine tests," he said, avoiding eye contact. His evasiveness only fueled Frank's curiosity and fear, hinting at a hidden danger tied to the mysterious objects. As Frank observed the expert's urgency and care, an unsettling thought began to form. The objects might pose a hazard. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. What if they were more than anomalies? What if they were dangerous? The scale of the investigation, the tight security, and the seriousness of the officials painted a grim picture. Frank couldn't escape the unwelcome reality that his beloved farm was at the center of something he couldn't comprehend. It was no longer his safe haven, but a site of unknown peril. Frank's thoughts turned to Jolene. The risks of the situation weighed heavily on him, and his concern for his family's safety overshadowed his personal turmoil. The uncertainty of what was happening made their well-being his top priority. Jolene's abrupt return caught Frank off guard. Her disbelief was evident as she took in the transformed farm. Seeing her shock mirrored his own guilt for bringing such chaos into their lives. As they reunited, their shared confusion became a mutual burden. Together, Frank and Jolene confronted the officials. "We deserve to know what's going on," Jolene insisted. But the vague responses only deepened their frustration. Feeling helpless, they clung to each other for strength, their bond providing a glimmer of solace amidst the uncertainty. Away from the chaos, Frank and Jolene embraced. The overwhelming stress was momentarily eased by their connection. In their shared fears, they found comfort, reminding each other that they were not alone in facing this ordeal. Standing side by side, Frank and Jolene watched the investigation unfold, their unspoken resolve providing strength. The breakthrough came when an expert identified the objects as a rare thoride variant. Frank, overhearing the term, tried to grasp its significance. The revelation intensified the investigation, introducing a sense of urgency. The rarity and unknown characteristics of thoride added layers of complexity, leaving Frank both intrigued and apprehensive. The atmosphere on the farm grew tense as officials discussed potential hazards. Words like radioactivity began circulating, and Frank noticed heightened caution in their actions. His growing worry mirrored the escalating seriousness of the situation. New safety measures, including barriers and protective gear, underscored the gravity of the discovery. Observing these precautions, Frank felt reassured yet alarmed. The transformation of his land into a high-risk zone marked a sobering turning point. An official revealed that the thoride was mildly radioactive. The news struck Frank with both fear and fascination, realizing the hidden danger beneath his land. This revelation set in motion a series of urgent actions, beginning with an immediate evacuation. Frank and Jolene were escorted to the hospital for tests. The urgency in the officials' actions made the couple acutely aware of the risks. As they left their familiar countryside for the sterile hospital environment, a heavy tension hung in the air. At the hospital, Frank and Jolene underwent extensive examinations to check for radiation exposure. The cold, clinical setting stood in stark contrast to their rustic farm life. They exchanged anxious glances throughout the procedures, their shared unease unspoken but deeply felt. Waiting for the results proved agonizing. Seated in a sterile room, they clung to each other for comfort. The silence stretched on until a doctor finally appeared. "So far, it looks like you might be okay," she said cautiously. The tentative news brought a glimmer of hope, though tempered by the need for further analysis. The early positive indications lifted their spirits slightly. Though more tests were needed, Frank and Jolene allowed themselves a measure of hope. On the journey back to the farm, their conversation turned to the possibility of moving forward, even as uncertainty loomed. The hospital stay extended as the couple underwent exhaustive tests. Each procedure delved deeper into potential radiation effects, heightening their stress. Yet they endured the monotony, driven by the hope for conclusive answers and closure. Amid the ordeal, Frank and Jolene found solace in each other. The waiting room became a space of emotional highs and lows. Through it all, Frank and Jolene clung to each other, their love a constant amidst the uncertainty. Finally, the moment arrived. The doctor entered with a folder, her face revealing nothing. As she announced the results, confirming that they were healthy with no signs of radiation harm, Frank and Jolene's relief was overwhelming. Tears welled up in their eyes as the burden of fear lifted. They embraced tightly, allowing the good news to sink in, grateful for this unexpected reprieve. With the confirmation of their health, Frank and Jolene began to envision a return to their normal life. They discussed plans for the future, considering how this experience had changed them. Day by day, Frank and Jolene witnessed the transformation of their farm. The once familiar landscape became a grid of activity as experts carefully removed the thoride. The couple watched from a distance, a mix of curiosity and nostalgia coloring their observations. This process, while ensuring their land's safety, was a poignant reminder of how quickly life could change, altering the very ground beneath their feet. As the removal process progressed, Frank and Jolene grappled with mixed emotions. Each patch of cleared land brought relief, knowing the potential danger was being eradicated, yet there was a sense of sadness too. The disruption to their land, the uprooting of the familiar, was a bitter pill to swallow. With the land finally cleared of thoride, Frank and Jolene faced the prospect of rebuilding. The farm, though changed, still held the promise of new beginnings. They discussed plans for restoration, envisioning a future that, while different, still brimmed with potential. As they stood together, looking over their recovering farm, Frank and Jolene found a newfound appreciation for the ordinary, the everyday life they once took for granted. The recent ordeal had brought a sharper focus on the value of health, the strength of their bond, and the simple joys of their rural existence. They looked forward to a future that was safer, simpler, and deeply cherished.